gives me immense pleasure to express a hearty welcome to our speaker, Dr. Abhishek Paru, sir, who gives his kind consent to be our speaker for today, managing his busy schedule. Dr. Abhishek Paru is an eminent scholar and academician. Presently, he is the assistant professor of Department of Humanities and Social Sciences of IIT Madras and associate fellow of UK Higher Education Academy. He is a member of International Society for the Studies of Narratives and Indian Association for Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies, and also an executive member of Modernist Studies in Asia. His areas of interest include modernism, masculinity studies, memory studies, critical theory. He is an author of many books, including Culture and the Literary Matter, Metaphor, Memory, Contracted with Romance and Little Phil. And another one is Postmodern Literatures, published in 2018 from Orient Black Swan. Apart from these, he presented many insightful papers at several conferences. Besides, a dozen of his research articles have been published in reputed national and international journals. Today, he is going to deliver a lecture on anxious masculinities, rereading Hamlet, and look back in anger. And our audience is eagerly waiting to hear you, sir. Now the platform is all yours. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this conference for inviting me in this platform, because I think this webinar series, and I've been following this series for a while now, since its inception. It has attracted some really excellent lectures from some excellent scholars from a range of disciplines. So as I was introduced as an introduction, the title of my talk today is Anxious Masculinities, and that's one of my research areas, shall we say. So I work in masculinity, memory studies, medical humanities, and also modernity and critical theory. So I'm hoping that this particular lecture will have some resonance with some of my colleagues and students attending this session. And very deliberately, I've taken two very canonical texts, and this is what I generally do. I take canonical texts written by mostly white writers, white critics, white intellectuals, and then I make an attempt to deconstruct those, to sort of foreground the fault lines, as it were. And I'm very interested in the idea of fault lines. This is obviously a term that we have borrowed from geography, where two landmasses meet but don't quite meet, that liminal space between landmasses. And we use this idea of liminality, shall we say, to look at how certain things are sort of smuggled in the text very, very covertly. And when we deconstruct those texts, it is our job, in a way, to tease out those possibilities, to tease out those readings which are otherwise lost on us. So first things first, let me give you a working definition of what I mean by masculinity. What is my working definition of masculinity in terms of how I'm going to map that into this particular discourse. So masculinity, I look at the whole idea of masculinity, obviously, as a performative category. I've drawn Butler, I've drawn Kaplan, I've drawn a series of critics and theorists who look at the whole idea of gender as a performative category. But I'm more interested in situating this performative category as an order of embodiment, right? Now, what do I mean by embodiment? Now, embodiment to me is a very complex phenomenon. Embodiment is obviously a biological category. Embodiment is something which happens with our bodies, with our nerves, with our nervous system, with our neurons, etc. So there is an embedded quality, shall we say, about embodiment, but equally, and this is a more interesting bit for me, there's equally an extended quality about embodiment, an enacted quality about embodiment, right? And for those of you interested in embodiment studies, I would recommend the work of Andy Clark, who has this very interesting 4E theory about cognition. The 4Es: enacted, embodied, extended, and embedded. The 4 ways of cognition. And I sort of draw on that a little bit in terms of how I look at embodiment. Embodiment as an embedded phenomenon, something which happens in your body, but also embodiment as an extended phenomenon, something which happens outside the body, in terms of how you navigate with the world around you, with the material, cultural, discursive, ideological apparatus around you. How do you navigate with that, right? And this constant loop, shall we say, between the inside and the outside, between the embedded and the extended, is what makes embodiment a very complex process. Now, having said that, and because we are from the domain of literature and literary studies, we take language very, very seriously. So how would you locate something like language, for example, in this order of embodiment? Language as an embedded phenomenon, and language as an extended phenomenon. Because I'm going to use this idea of language, and I'm going to take this and come into the 2 texts, Hamlet and Look Back in Anger, because in both the texts, language is a very important phenomenon. It's a very important process. Language, linguistic or language games become a very important process of embodiment in Hamlet as well as in Look Back in Anger. And I'm going to look at these 2 texts specifically. So how would you locate something like language in this study of embodiment? Because on the one hand, language too has an embedded quality, something which we learn through our neurons, something which we process through our brains. We pick up the grammar, we pick up the vocabulary. So there is that cognitive embedded quality about language. But equally, there's also an enacted quality about language. How do you perform language? How do you enact language? How do you extend language in terms of connecting to the social spaces around you? So in terms of how you make meanings, in terms of how you become a meaning, a meaningful signifier, right? And of course, if you push it a little bit too much, then you come to the post-structuralist domain, where the relationship between signifier and signified becomes quite fluid and sometimes messy in a delicious, deconstructive way, right? And I'm going to talk about the messiness of language as well as we move on. So language, to me, is a very important factor in embodiment, in terms of how you situate your body, situate your identity, in terms of how you locate it, in terms of how you enact it in a social space, right? So
I'm very sorry, sir. I wanted to mute this fellow, but I mistakenly muted you. I'm very sorry, sir. Can you hear me, sir?
am I audible? Am I
Yes, sir,
audible?
you're audible. Yes.
Yeah.
Sir,
Was I
sir,
audible so
give me
long?
1 second. Sir, give me 1 second to unmute this participant. Yeah, sir.
Sir, it will be better if you use your headphones, sir. The voice is not clear.
Okay, I will see if I have a headphone. 1 second. Just give me a second, please. Hi, am I audible now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Is it better?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So just very quickly rehearsing some of the things I said before I move on to the two texts. So I look at embodiment, I look at language as an embedded category and equally as an extended category, as a performative category. So language is something which you learn, it's something which you process neurally through neurons, so the brain systems, but equally it's something which you perform, shall we say, in social spaces. So in that sense, it's quite discursive in quality. It's something which is a bit of a performative thing. And I look at the whole idea of gender and masculinity as not just a biological phenomenon, not just a sexual phenomenon, not just a cultural phenomenon, but also as a linguistic phenomenon, something in a way you use language. And as I mentioned before we got interrupted, that language is a very important part of the embodiment process in both Look Back in Anger and Hamlet. Of course, Hamlet is entirely about language games. He has this whole stage because he is a very good player of the language game, right? So with that preamble about masculinity and language and embodiment, let's dive into the title of this talk today, which is Anxious Masculinity. So I very deliberately use the word anxious because I was tempted to use the word hysteric because I thought they'd be pushing it too much, so I kept it anxious. But I actually mean hysteric. I actually mean hysteria and masculinity. And as some of you know, some of you do research in hysteria and gender and sexuality and illness, etc. You know that hysteria has always been very stereotypically associated with a female malady, something which happens to a woman, something which comes from the womb. That's the etymology of the word. It comes from the womb. So it can only affect women because of the weak nerves, quote unquote weak nerves. And of course, men have flawless nerves. Men have very steely nerves, so they don't become hysteric at all. So I look at these two texts, Hamlet and Look Back in Anger, as examples of hysteric masculinity, right? So how masculinity becomes hysteric in quality. Now, let's look at Hamlet first, and then we move on to Look Back in Anger and try to connect these two texts. Now, as I mentioned, language is a very important signifier in Hamlet, in the sense that it becomes a marker of privilege, a marker of entitlement, a marker of your location in society, etc. So the very opening of Hamlet, if you remember, the famous opening where the ghost is seen to be sort of roaming around on the borders between Denmark and Norway, and we have two ill-educated watchmen who are discussing the ghost. And I use the word ill-educated quite deliberately because it's a very, very elitist play. It's a play about people who know language and people who don't know language. So different kinds of men. So these men who guard the borders are just soldiers, simply soldiers who are probably strong in terms of their body, in terms of their muscles, but they are not sufficiently male because they don't know the language talk to the ghost. That's why they bring in someone called Horatio. I'm sure those of you who read it would remember. And Horatio is brought in because Horatio can converse in Latin, which for some mysterious reason is a language of the ghost. The ghost can speak in Latin, and apparently when you die, you speak Latin. So there is this very interesting linguistic, almost funny linguistic angle in Hamlet. So the ghost can only speak in Latin. And so Horatio is brought in, and he's trying to have a conversation with the ghost. And of course, if you take a look at the ghost, who is apparently Hamlet's father, he is described as being dressed up in armor, in a very, very military apparel, and a very, very military dress. And so he has his armor, he's a soldier, he's a warrior king, and he's someone who is very, very, sorely missed. And we find this absence of a strong male in Denmark is constantly talked about. There is no strong male controlling the kingdom, as a result of which we have this incursions coming in from Norway. So among other things, I think we often underestimate the political importance of Hamlet, because I think it's a very important play in terms of looking at Scandinavian geopolitics, in terms of looking at the relationship in Denmark and Norway. The borders obviously are the liminal space, the territory between two kingdoms, and that's also interestingly and symbolically the territory in which the ghost inhabits. And there's a very interesting, very peculiar quality about Hamlet's father's ghost in Hamlet, because it's not really become very important fault lines in Hamlet, and that's where the ghost keeps coming, keeps recurring. And obviously, as we move on in the play, we find that this absence of a strong male is constantly foregrounded. There's one figure, before I come to Hamlet, I will just talk about these other figures as well. There are some very important figures in Hamlet who don't really appear on stage, but they're actually quite important in terms of the masculinity politics. And one very, very key figure who is often understudied in the play is Fortinbras. As some of you know, those of you who read the play, I'm sure would relate. He's a Norwegian warrior who is, is a big threat to Denmark now geopolitically. He's seeking to avenge his earlier humiliation that his uncle had suffered, and he has this band of men. He's roaming around with it's like a guerrilla war, and he's trying to create problems for Denmark. He's trying to get in every now and then. Now, interestingly, we find that the way Hamlet looks at Fortinbras, there's a degree of admiration, which is almost erotic in quality. In a way, Hamlet looks at Fortinbras. It's almost like saying, oh, he is that man that I want to be. He's a warrior prince that I want to be, but I can't because I'm just a scholar. I'm just a university student, and I cannot be the warrior prince. And his gaze on Fortinbras is very, very one of admiration. And like you mentioned, if you tease it deeply enough, there's almost a homoerotic quality. He's like attracted to Fortinbras because he's the kind of man, Fortinbras is the kind of man that he wants to be, but he cannot, because all he can do apparently is speak. All he can do is perform language games on stage, and it takes a huge amount of time to get the revenge thing going. He cannot kill Claudius. He uses up a lot of time and space, and it comes to all kinds of excuses to procrastinate. And then, of course, in the end, everyone dies in Hamlet. It's actually, we talk about Hamlet being a very, very philosophical play, full of language games and intellectual discussions, but it's actually a very bloody play. If you count the number of people who die in the end of Hamlet, the dead body count is huge. It's like Rambo in the end. Everyone dies at the end of Hamlet. And it's like a sequence of that. Hamlet dies, Gertrude dies, Claudius dies, and before that we have, obviously Laertes dying with Hamlet. And then, a series of people, Rosencrantz, Guildenstern die off stage. So the dead body count in Hamlet is actually quite high in terms of the Shakespeare quotient. So it's actually a very bloody play. It's actually a very, very keen and gruesomely revenge tragedy. But then, of course, the language becomes the overarching metaphor. The language games, the elegance of language becomes important. But at this point, I just want to stress the relationship in Hamlet and Fortinbras in this play, because the anxiety of Hamlet, and this is why I've titled my talk Anxious Masculinity, the anxiety of Hamlet is the anxiety to, shall we say, appropriate a military masculine signifier. He wants to be this military prince. He wants to be this controlling warrior. He wants to be his father. He wants to, and this is obviously very Freudian. He wants to fill in the father's shoe, and his father obviously was a great warrior king. We are constantly told what a great warrior he was. How brutal and how important he was in terms of his military strategy, etc. So his death has obviously has produced a void in Hamlet that neither Claudius nor Hamlet can fill in. And Fortinbras seems to be the right kind of son for Hamlet's father. So we have this very complex father-son equation going on, because Fortinbras is the kind of king that Denmark needs, shall we say. And if you remember the end of Hamlet, when Hamlet dies and Fortinbras makes an appearance on the stage, those of you who know, remember the scene where Hamlet, before he dies, he asks Horatio, what is the sound that I hear? And Horatio says, well, that's Fortinbras coming in, and he's probably going to take over Denmark. And Hamlet interestingly says, well, tell him that he has my dying voice. And it's something very, very erotic about that. It's like giving your body to Fortinbras. It's like I'm giving my voice to Fortinbras. I'm passing on the heir of the kingdom, the legacy, the body of Denmark to Fortinbras, because he's the more able man. He's the fitter man, shall we say, the stronger man to carry on the religious, the political and military duties of Denmark that Denmark deserves. So he's a right son of my father in that sense. So I'm this weak son who's dying, who took a lot of time to kill, to avenge his father, but now the Fortinbras has come, and despite his Norwegian status, it's not really Danish, but despite his Norwegian status, tell him that he has my dying voice. I give him my body. So it's like presenting my kingdom, my body. And of course, as you know, the body politic and the body biologic in Shakespeare is very complexly connected. The body of Duncan, for example, in Macbeth, is a body of Scotland that Macbeth is usurping. So killing Duncan's body is abusing the body of Scotland in some sense. So the body of the king is actually very symbolic. It's not just biological, it's also quite political in quality. So the body of Claudius, the body of Hamlet the father, and the body of Hamlet the prince, and also interestingly, Hamlet the father and Hamlet the prince, they have the same names. So we have this example of transference, male transference, which goes on and which ends with Fortinbras. So those of you interested in the study of masculinity in Hamlet, I would advise, I would encourage you dig up the character of Fortinbras, because he's a very, very important figure in Hamlet in terms of the masculinity politics. Now, so this being the political, the geopolitical scenario in Hamlet, let's talk about what it started off with, which is a language game. So, as I mentioned, Latin is important language. Latin is a language which for some reason the hero speaks, and which is obviously a marker of privilege, a marker of education. And Hamlet comes back from a university. He studied philosophy, so he's very much a misfit in the Scandinavian military domain. He's too educated, too sophisticated, too soft, shall we say, to be a military king. So he has this constant struggle, this constant anxiety to appropriate that kind of a vendetta narrative, right? And again, that is part of the anxiety in Hamlet, that he cannot carry out, he cannot perform the kind of masculinity expected of him. And his performance anxiety becomes a very important deal in Hamlet, which becomes political in quality, which becomes sexual in quality. If you remember his transactions with the woman around him, Ophelia, Gertrude, there's this almost hysteric quality with which he abuses them with language that obviously that reveals his performance anxiety in terms of how he cannot carry out his bodily functions. He cannot carry out his political functions. Again, see, the body and the political narrative are connected together in Hamlet in very interesting ways. So, the whole idea of language becomes important in Hamlet, because the only way that he constantly embodies himself on stage is through language, because he cannot act, he cannot carry out the actions required of him. So language becomes the only, shall we say, instrument of action in Hamlet, the only way, the only instrument through which you can attain his embodiment, because nothing else will work for him in this Danish, very, very military Danish political kingdom, right? However, having said that, there is one scene in Hamlet which I find fascinating, in terms of how Hamlet actually gets beaten in his own language game. And I'm sure some of you would guess it by now what that scene is. It's a grave digger scene in Hamlet, which I think is just brilliant. If someone wants to do a post-structuralist study of Hamlet, that is the one scene really that should crop up. Because we have over there, and this is obviously very Marxist as well, it's Freudian, it's Marxist, it's Lacanian, it's actually everything. And it's full of language games. So let's look at the Marxist bit first. So we have two lowly grave diggers who've never been to university, who are uneducated, etc. But they are better at punning. They are better at performing with language. They are better with irony than Hamlet is, for some reason. And Hamlet actually gets beaten in language game in that particular scene. And his anxiety as a prince comes out very quickly when he says, "Oh, this is a very strange age where the lowly people can speak back to the likes of us," right? So this is actually a very, very strange, a very, very bizarre, a very weird age, where there's no distinction. The distinction of language is blurring away. And the two grave diggers, obviously, they're quite Freudian, because they're digging the grave and they're about to put Ophelia inside it. And of course, Hamlet would jump inside it, the grave, to exhibit his love, etc. But before that, Hamlet comes in with his band of men. He has his boy band with him all the time. And then he's trying to outwit the grave diggers, and he's spectacularly vanquished in this attempt, because the grave diggers are not only better at language, they're better at pun, they're better at metaphors, they're better at playing with language. So in terms of twisting language, in terms of being post-structuralist with language, they obviously become, they defeat Hamlet spectacularly. And also it becomes quite Freudian, because they are also, shall we say, the guardians of death. So they're somewhere between Eros and Thanatos, to use Freudian terms, but in life and death. And again, the grave in itself is a very liminal territory. So the entire play of Hamlet is full of this liminal territory. The border between Denmark and Norway, the border between life and death, the grave between life and death, where you get buried inside. And of course, we find that particular scene, the grave digger scene in Hamlet, it ends with a spectacular display of male hysteria, where both Laertes and Hamlet, they try to display their love for Ophelia by jumping onto the grave. over and over again, right? So Hamlet wants to say, I love Ophelia more than 10,000 brothers, and later gets mad, say, how dare you, I'm a brother, etc. So it really becomes like two boys trying to exhibit their love for a toy. And I use the word toy quite deliberately because Ophelia is just a toy in this play. It's actually a very, very, very misogynist play. And this misogyny is very important. And I'm going to use the misogyny when I come to Look Back in Anger as well. Misogyny becomes a dramatic performance. It's not just a culture. It also becomes part of the language game. The language is very, very male. The language is very, very misogynist. The language is directed at the female body. The way Hamlet abuses his mother with language is obviously very misogynist, and of course Ophelia just becomes a pawn, shall we say, in this male power game between Claudius, between Latus and Hamlet, and everyone around him. And obviously her very symbolic drowning is a drowning of the female in a fluid space, where she doesn't have the agency to float anymore. She doesn't have the agency to say anymore. And obviously, if you remember the play, she ends up singing a mad woman's song. So this departure from language, that she's not allowed to speak, she's not allowed to perform language, because language belongs to the males. Language is a male territory. Language is a male performance. So she ends up becoming a mad woman who's singing. So singing obviously is a departure from meaningful language, right? So the mad woman song in Ophelia is a very interesting linguistic symbol in the play, because meaningful language is owned by the men. Meaningful logic is owned by the men. They can play with logic. The likes of Hamlet can play with logic because he's educated, he's university educated, he comes back, he's male, he's obviously entitled. So language becomes quite essentially a commodity in Hamlet. And obviously the commodity is denied to the woman, to the females. And Ophelia ends up being singing a mad woman song, and she drowns in a very symbolic death, which we may call suicide, right? So the entire play of Hamlet is full of this language games. It's about this anxiety to embody yourself as a military prince. And of course, the way Fortinbras is presented in the play, there is no woman associated with him. So he is this perfect male. He doesn't have a mother, he doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have a girlfriend. So he's not really emasculated in a way that Hamlet is. So again, the fear of the woman is there, and that's part of the misogyny, that a woman can emasculate you in some sense. So Ophelia is seen as someone who is a threat to Hamlet's aspiration towards military masculinity, because that's what he wants to be. He has aspiration to be the strong military male, which he cannot be eventually. So he lends his voice, his body to Fortinbras, who is already that male construct, right? So I look at the entire play of Hamlet as an example of male hysteria, and obviously that is connected to misogyny. That's very, very sexist in quality, and language becomes obviously the instrument of sexism, the instrument of misogyny, the instrument of hysteria. That is how the hysteria is performed over and over again. Now let's quickly jump cut into Look Back in Anger and see how that connects to Hamlet, and maybe they can come back in the end and do a summary of the two plays in which I will wind up the session as well. Now there have been lots of reviews of Look Back in Anger where Jimmy Porter is seen as some kind of a neo-Hamlet in England in a post-Second World War, post-imperial England. And of course, there are these very similar markers of anxiety, very similar markers of masculinity crisis, very similar markers of misogyny in Look Back in Anger as well. But there's one fundamental difference between Look Back in Anger and Hamlet, especially in Jimmy Porter and Hamlet, the character, and that is obviously Hamlet's location in a very, very elitist position as a prince of Denmark, because that's what the title says, Hamlet, the prince of Denmark, and his princely status is never lost sight of. Whereas Jimmy Porter, I mean, there's one very good way of looking at Look Back in Anger is completely a Marxist play. It's about a working class man trying to class up through education. And obviously, those of you who read the play would know that this is a play which is the post-1944 Education Act, which would sort of get free university education to everyone in England. So education was not really limited anymore to the upper classes, to the middle classes, but it became more disseminated, more distributive in quality, in terms of allowing the lower classes to also climb up the social ladder, the class ladder, through education. So Jimmy Porter is a product of that Education Act, the 1944 Education Act. And he's obviously someone who belongs to the post-Labour Party government, England, where after 1947, where Churchill lost the election and Attlee came to power, there was a lot of euphoria and optimism politically as well as culturally in terms of how this was a new dawn for the working class. The imperialism had ended, the working class were coming up, so there was a lot of aspiration in terms of becoming a democratic country class-wise, which obviously was a colossal failure in the end. Right, so the entire place about being disillusioned with a lot of political promises. However, language becomes a very important instrument to look back in anger as well, because if you take a look at Jimmy Porter, he's very, very anxious in the way he's using language. He's very metaphorical in quality. He's constantly quoting Wordsworth. He's constantly quoting Mary Shelley. He's constantly quoting Shakespeare. And that's obviously part of his anxiety package, shall we say. He's very, very anxious to appropriate the elite marker of masculinity, right? And he knows he's not good looking, he's not a prince, he's not endowed with capital. So the only capital he possesses is a linguistic capital. The only capital he possesses is the cultural capital which he has acquired through university education, right? That's the only capital available to him, right? And he uses his capital to get crash, shall we say, to trespass the upper class territory. It's a supremely intensely class conscious play, and class in England is almost as evil as caste in India in terms of how the discrimination operates at various levels. We have this joke about Englishmen: the moment they open their mouths, the accent betrays your class. And obviously, people spend a lot of time and effort to neutralize their accents in terms of disguising their class locations, right? And we have several references to the Welsh accent in Look Back in Anger, how Jimmy's friend, he's a Welshman, and he shares a house with Jimmy, Cliff Lewis, and obviously the accent of Cliff is very, very Welsh. Those of you who've seen the play, those of you who've seen a dramatic production, or even a film starring Richard Burton, I recommend that quite heavily. Burton plays Jimmy Porter in a really good film. So anyway, in that film, we have this constant reference to Cliff's Welsh accent, which is obviously a very working class accent. Accent, language, they become very important markers of masculinity in Look Back in Anger, right? And obviously Jimmy Porter comes from working class himself, but he's very, very anxious to climb up the class ladder, and he does that with language and also does that with marriage, right? So his marriage can be seen as some kind of a revenge, shall we say, on the upper class, because he marries Alison, who's his wife, who is a very upper class woman. He marries her as some kind of revenge, and that's something that Alison tells Helena later on, that my marriage to Jimmy, from Jimmy's perspective, was a revenge taken on the upper class. And now, interestingly, we have Jimmy's father in that particular play in Look Back in Anger. It's a bit like Hamlet's father's ghost. He's always dying and undying, an undead presence. There's something slightly, shall we say, hauntological and spectral about that character. So the spectrality of Jimmy Porter's father and the spectrality of Hamlet's father are actually quite interestingly comparable. So you have a long scene in Look Back in Anger. Those of you who read it will know, where Jimmy is describing the very slow dying of his own father, how he's a very disillusioned man, and he was this very young boy, just neurotically consuming the death of his own father, and that has obviously become traumatic for him, and that trauma has never quite left him in terms of how it affects him still existentially as well as emotionally. So again, the dying father almost triggers a vendetta in Look Back in Anger, and Jimmy Porter, just like the dying father, dead father, triggers a vendetta in Hamlet as well. And both characters, Hamlet and Jimmy Porter, they are insufficient avengers in some sense. So they try to avenge the dead fathers, try to avenge the dying fathers, but they're insufficiently masculine in that sense. So the anxiety, obviously, and I come back to my opening point, the anxiety comes from a quality of aspiration. The anxiety comes from an insufficient embodiment, right? The anxiety comes from hysteric use of language in terms of how you're trying to appropriate a certain marker of masculinity, but you're failing to do so. And in the failure lies the anxiety. So, Look Back in Anger is more directly hysteric than Hamlet. I mean, Hamlet, of course, is hysteria. If you remember the scene where Hamlet is screaming at Ophelia, asking her to get into a nunnery, and there's almost sexual rage against Ophelia. And we have several such screaming scenes in Look Back in Anger, whereas the male who is screaming, the man who is screaming hysterically in terms of how his, this pirate against the woman, which is very sexual in quality, but also quite linguistic in quality. It's like an abuse of the woman. It's supremely misogynist, the way the woman is used and abused in Look Back in Anger, and also in Hamlet, right? Now, and obviously the whole idea of Hamlet and Look Back in Anger, we need to treat both places politically as well, because I find Hamlet, obviously Look Back in Anger is more directly political, and Hamlet too is supremely and profoundly political, because as I mentioned, we need to bear in mind the Scandinavian geopolitics around Hamlet, the Norway-Denmark war, and how Fortinbras comes in. Despite being a Norwegian, he is a strong male who is absent from the stage, but he's admired at. There's almost a homoerotic quality in a way Fortinbras is looked at by Hamlet. Now, there's a similar character in Look Back in Anger as well. Someone who doesn't really appear on the stage, but someone who's out there, and Jimmy Porter looks at him with some kind of envy, which is almost homoerotic in quality. Strong male outside, who almost never appears except as a very fleeting presence, and that character is Hugh, right? So Hugh, becomes a very important character in Look Back in Anger, and we are told he was a strong man. He was just more, virile than Jimmy. Was more abusive than Jimmy. So strong in that sense, being aggressive, being strong, being virile, being someone who gets his work done, and he goes up to China of all places. So he disappears from the stage, but he is constantly mentioned in terms as a reference, as a marker of masculinity that Jimmy Porter aspires to be, but it fails to be. And obviously, in the aspiration, failure, entanglement, that is where the hysteria emerges from. Now, one more very important character, one more father figure in Look Back in Anger is obviously Alison's father, Colonel Redfern, who's a very important character, politically speaking, because he represents, so he symbolically embodies the end of the era, the end of a particular colonial era in Look Back in Anger, because he's obviously stationed in India, and we are constantly given references to a very, very colonial India, which from a British perspective is very rosy, very romantic, very, very fecund and fertile in quality. But of course, it comes to an end very symbolically. The sun actually sets on the British Empire, and it comes back to England. Now, once it comes back to England, he also experiences some kind of masculinity crisis, we are told in the play, because he is puzzled to know that he's not really obeyed anymore. Imperialism has ended, and he's so used to being obeyed, he's so used to being waited upon, that he finds himself struggling to negotiate in being just an ordinary citizen in London, a very ordinary citizen back in England, in a very post-imperial England, right? So his authority is now not unquestionable anymore. So there seems to be some kind of a symbolic castration that he has suffered, a symbolic emasculation that he has suffered in terms of his authority. And we find this is very bizarre and almost perverse empathy that is established between Jimmy and Colonel Redfern, despite their very different class locations. There should be enemies, there should be each other's throats. However, in the play, we find that two males seem to understand each other in terms of the crisis, right? And it's a very important, lovely line where Alison says to her own father that you are sad, you're disturbed because everything has changed, and Jimmy is disturbed because nothing has changed. Something must have gone wrong somewhere. And obviously, Jimmy Porter's location and Colin Redfern's location must be situated across the imperial line. So Colin Redfern used to be the strong man, used to be this colonial officer who's suddenly just an ordinary citizen. So therein lies this emasculation. And Jimmy Porter is obviously a post-imperial generation who realizes England is not really a superpower anymore, and who feels betrayed and who feels cheated by his earlier generation, who he thinks have taken away all the privileges. So there's nothing left for him at all. And we have this constant refrain of no brave, good causes left anymore, right? There's no political cause left anymore, nothing to die for. And this emasculation of Jimmy Porter and Redfern must be seen politically as some kind of emasculation suffered by England as a country. Because remember, this was also the end of the Second World War. 1956 was the time in which this play was produced. This is also the beginning of the Cold War, when the power politics have changed in the world. The global politics have changed, and England is no longer a superpower. We have two new superpowers emerging, which are the USA and the USSR. We have the nuclear war coming up, the threat of the nuclear war coming up. And the Cold War is obviously breeding a new kind of imperialism. And England is being lost in the game. England is just gone. It's just an old Saran. It's someone who's lagging behind. So the emasculation of Colonel Redfern is also some kind of political emasculation suffered by England as a country, right? So we have this different political, personal, ideological, biological, sexual orders of emasculation going on in Look Back in Anger. And obviously the whole thing is done very, very linguistically, right? So the language games become very important. The violence of language becomes important. The quality of language becomes very important. And sometimes it's very important to look at Hamlet, because there seems to be some kind of disguising of violence. We don't quite understand how violent it is because of the elegance in language, right? So the elegance in Hamlet's language makes it a more covertly violent play, because, make no mistake, it's a play about abuse. It abuses a woman. It's a very misogynistic kind of a play, but it somehow tries to conceal its misogyny with the elegance of language, right? And that's a very important point. And I made this very vulgar reference with Hamlet and certain other texts that I'm going to mention, and that might actually shock you in terms of its vulgarity. But I find it very useful in terms of looking at certain reproductions of that kind of masculinity, right? So we have a series of examples, for example, in current Bollywood, in current film industry, where, for example, this Telugu film, Arjun Reddy, I think, that was made into a Bollywood film later, right? I don't quite remember the name of the Bollywood film, but it had Shahid Kapoor in it. So anyway, the point is not that. The point is that it's very directly a film about abuse, very directly a film about a male abusing a female, a very violent male, a very aggressive male, and that somehow seems to glamorize that kind of, yes, someone wrote Kabir saying, thank you very much. I'm not very switched on, but yeah, that was a very helpful reference. So yeah, so the whole idea of that violent male abusing the woman and sort of getting away with that, and in a way that being glamorized and consumed as some kind of a, not just acceptable, but also a cool celebration of masculinity. Now, the point is, it is easier for us, the so-called students of gender, to sort of shoot it down very quickly and say, oh, this is actually unacceptable, this is terrible, this is insufferable, and this should not happen, this should not be portrayed in this way. So it's easier for us to understand and decry that kind of violence, because it's very, very inelegant. But, and this is the interesting bit, it is more difficult for us to decry Hamlet, because make no mistake, he's also an abuser. He's a serial abuser of a woman. But he gets away with that to a certain extent because of his elegance of language. And this is where I come back to my opening point about embodiment. Language as a non-innocent instrument of embodiment is profoundly non-innocent. Language is never innocent. How you use language is never innocent. And the only scene in the play where Hamlet gets caught out is a gravedigger scene. He's spectacularly exposed in that scene, where two gravediggers castrate him linguistically, and he's just writhing in pain. He doesn't know where to escape, and it's a delicious scene. I love reading that scene in Hamlet, because that's the only scene in the whole play where he gets really slapped with language. He gets beaten in his own game, because everywhere else he's winning. He's this university educated student. He's good at language. He has this Lutardian language game going on all the time, and no one can beat him. Everyone is at awe with him in terms of his linguistic ability, which he's using to justify so many other things, his abuse of women, etc. Right? But in that particular scene, he gets beaten, he gets vanquished, he gets castrated linguistically by two working class men. And that is the reason why I find that scene so interesting. Now, just to wind up, and I'm just going to take some questions if there are any. Just to wind up this discussion, when you see a film like Arjun Reddy or Kabir Singh, we find that it's easier to attack that film because of its non-sophisticated quality. But when you see something like Look Back in Anger and Hamlet, we tend to sort of celebrate those characters in some sense because they're so philosophical, because they're so elegant in language, because their masculinity comes with a package of elegance, a package of education, a package of accent, a package of sophistication, which sort of disguises the violence that they otherwise embody. Because if you look at the way they treat women as commodities, in terms of Ophelia, in terms of Alison, in terms of Helena, and Look Back in Anger, there seems to be a complete lack of empathy in terms of how the women are treated. Women are used as pawns in the power game. I mean, June Porter marries Alison quite clearly to class up, to take a revenge in some kind of a class war that goes on. And Ophelia, of course, is a completely a passive pawn. She's not even allowed to speak. And as I mentioned, the mad song of Ophelia is a very symbolic departure from meaningful language, which can only be owned by the strong, powerful, politically powerful males in the play. Right. So in my conclusion, I would say, when we look at anxious masculinity, when we look at masculinity as a category, we need to take language very, very importantly, because language is never apolitical. Language is never gendered in quality. It's supremely gendered. It's supremely political. And also, it can often become an excuse to cover up for certain kinds of abusive behavior, which we otherwise see. I mean, Hamlet has been celebrated as this lofty, elegant prince of Denmark throughout scholarship, throughout Shakespeare scholarship. But I think it's high time we look at the misogyny of Hamlet. We look at the way in which women are abused in Hamlet, and he gets away with that. Unlike Arjun Reddy, unlike Kabir Singh, because his language is so soft, because his language is so sophisticated, and that obviously it makes it a covert form of violence, which is perhaps more surreptitious and more insidious in quality. So I stop at this point, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir. First of all, on behalf of the organizers, I, Chinmay Mandal, apologize for the interruption made in the middle of your lecture. Sorry for that, sir.
No, that's okay.
But this is really an engaging, informative, and well-researched talk. And thank you once again. And now the forum is open for the participants to clear their queries, if any. There is a question in the chat box.
Yes.
Can you take the question?
I'm trying to find it. Is it Malini Chundar?
Yes.
Yes, so often Hamlet is seen as a feminine character, besides King Hamlet later in Fortinbras when he's unable to make decisions and embodying his masculine qualities. Yeah, exactly. I did mention that as well. I mean, the part of the anxiety of Hamlet is obviously a performance anxiety. He's a student, he's a university educated student, and suddenly he has to take control in a very, very male and military kingdom, and is obviously insufficient. He's sort of emasculated. He's not man enough, shall we say, to carry that out. And I think this is a good question, because I think part of the reason why he speaks so much in the play, I mean, he's so talkative as a character, he bores you to death. It's such a boring play in terms of how much time he takes up. And I think that's some kind of an overcompensation that he's doing. It's a linguistic overcompensation in terms of his inability to act physically, right? Whereas Fortinbras almost never speaks. I mean, he just comes in, does his job, and goes away. And Hamlet has this admiring gaze on Fortinbras. He's looking at Fortinbras as some kind of the male. And as I mentioned, one of the last things he says before he passes away, is, he has my dying voice. He's like, it's given my language, right? He has everything else, right? So I think it's a very valid question. There's a sense of emasculation that Hamlet is suffering all the time. And therein lies this hysteria, shall we say. He's a very hysteric character because he's not able to carry out the functions expected of him. We have this joke in Shakespeare scholarship, don't we, that if Hamlet and Macbeth were in each other's positions, there'd be no tragedy at all, right? Macbeth would think twice before killing Duncan, and hence not kill Duncan, and there'd be no tragedy. And Hamlet would just go and kill Claudius if he were Macbeth, and that'd be the end of it, right? So, and there's a very interesting, a very funny parody, I think, of Hamlet. I don't know if some of you have seen it. There's an Arnold Schwarzenegger film called The Last Action Hero. Has anyone seen that film? The Last Action Hero, where there's this boy who idolizes Schwarzenegger all the time. A young boy who has Schwarzenegger's posters everywhere in the room, and Schwarzenegger appears as Arnold Schwarzenegger. And there's a dream scene in that film, very funny, where the boy is attending a Hamlet class, and the teacher in the class is trying to sound a bit cool. He's saying, well, Hamlet is boring, Hamlet speaks a lot, but don't forget it's also a revenge tragedy. So he's some kind of an action hero. And the moment he hears the word action hero, his antenna goes up. And he has this reverie where, this is so funny, Schwarzenegger appears as Hamlet, and can you believe it? Arnold Schwarzenegger as Hamlet. And he comes in a horse, smoking a cigar. And he has obviously this very strong Austrian accent. He gets in there's a dream sequence in a horse, and he goes up to someone and says, "Hi, are you Claudius?" And then this person says, "Yes, I am." I said, "Did you kill my father?" I say, "Yes, I killed your father." And he puts his gun and shoots him. It's a big mistake. And that's the end of it, right? But that is the kind of masculinity expected of Hamlet in some sense, right? And he cannot carry out that masculinity at all. And it's another very interesting adaptation of Hamlet, which is more serious in quality. It's just called Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, where I think Ethan Hawke plays Hamlet. He is Hamlet in Manhattan in New York, but it retains the original Elizabethan language, where the to be and not to be seen, the very famous soliloquy of Hamlet, it is executed in a supermarket, in a departmental store. And we have Hamlet as Ethan Hawke is pushing the trolley in a departmental store. And interestingly, this is a DVD section where he is in a departmental store. And he's saying to be or not to be, that is the question. And the DVD genre, the cinema genre that he is surrounded by are action genres. It's action, 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 action all the time. Right. So again, it's a very visual, symbolic foregrounding of his inability to act, which I think is part of the question that Malini Chondar is asking. Yes, thank you.
There are 4 more questions in the chat box.
Okay, let me scroll down. Okay, so Debhargo Chakraborty, should we call Hamlet a representative of subordinate masculinity or a representative of hegemonic masculinity who wants to exercise power? Excellent question. And this question, it sort of reveals the fact that these categories are so blurred, subordinate and hegemonic, because technically he's hegemonic. He's a prince of Denmark. I mean, you can't get more hegemonic than that. I mean, he's born with the hegemony. He's born with the hegemonic spoon in his mouth. He has language. He has Latin. He's been to university. His father is Hamlet. His uncle is Claudius. He has his boy band with him all the time. However, and this is a big however, connected to the earlier question as well, he cannot carry out the performance expected of him. So he ends up being subordinate. And in the end, we have an outsider, quite literally a geopolitical outsider who becomes the hegemonic man, with the approval of Hamlet. And that's a real interesting bit. Politically speaking, it's such an important scene where he's almost approving a Norwegian coming in and taking over Denmark, because he seems to be the fitter male. Right. So I think we should take a look at Hamlet in terms of masculinity in a more post-structuralist lens, where these categories become very blurred and they become interconnected and they entangle with each other in ways which are quite asymmetric in quality. Yes. Okay, then we have Sudipta Banerjee. Is language a tool through which a disguise the real personality occur? Well, most definitely in Hamlet and Look Back in Anger, because both of them, Jimmy Porter and Hamlet, they are trying to be something they're not, right? And the only instrument they have is language, especially with Jimmy Porter. He doesn't have anything else. He doesn't have money. He doesn't have royalty. He doesn't have good looks. All he has is an accent and a vocabulary. And that's why, if we take a look at Jimmy Porter's language, it's so literary in quality. It's full of Wordsworth and Emily Bronte and Shakespeare and perhaps Tennyson. It's this cocktail of erudite references. And the reason is he's very, very anxious to appear educated, and not just in terms of language, but also in terms of how he's dressed up in the play. I mean, even inside the house, he's wearing a tweed coat. Now, tweed coat is a very, very erudite garment, right? So tweed is generally seen as university professors' attire. So if you're wearing tweed, you're upper class. If you're wearing tweed, then you're educated. You've been to university. But mind you, he's wearing a very shabby tweed coat. So maybe it's secondhand, maybe bought it from a secondhand store. But again, this sartorial appropriation, that he's wearing something, and that's part of the aspiration package. And he's also smoking a pipe, not a cigarette, mind you, right? So again, this aspiration, this markers of privilege, the markers of upper class masculinity is being appropriated and performed through language, through sartorial signifiers, through different activities, etc. So the disguise of real personality, I would say, it's more of an aspiration. It's more of an aspirational category, which is obviously profoundly performative in quality. Okay. Then we have Dr. Seema Sarkar. What correlation do you find in the Bear Squirrel game episode and Look Back in Anger and Hamlet and Ophelia relationship? Very, very good question. The Bear Squirrel game becomes some kind of a symbolic utopia in Look Back in Anger, right? And again, it's a very unequal choice of metaphors. The bear can kill a squirrel anytime. If you think of the symbols quite literally, it's hardly an equal choice of metaphors. The squirrel is a very helpless animal, and the bear is obviously huge. And they become the proxy presences in some sense in Look Back in Anger. So the inequality of the gender relationship is manifested also, I mean, not just in terms of how things really happen, but also in terms of the symbolic side, in terms of the romantic side. Even the romance is so unequal in quality, right? So the male is always a bear, and the squirrel, and the female is always a squirrel, and obviously the bear is exponentially more strong than a squirrel, and that therein lies the inequality in the relationship. And we have something similar in Hamlet and Ophelia, where Ophelia is literally pushed to a suicide by the abuse, the systematic abuse of Hamlet, not just Hamlet, but also the other powerful men around him. Right, so her father, her brother, they all push her towards a certain kind of performance. Hamlet obviously comes in and expresses a sexual disgust at Ophelia, which pushes her, asking her to go to nunnery, staying a virgin, and obviously this obsession with chastity, the obsession with hygiene is very, very important, and that's a very male thing. Right, the woman should always be virgin. The woman should always be clean. The woman should always protect the lineage in some sense. And any deviation from that behavior is received with disgust. So I think the Hamlet-Ophelia relationship is a very unequal relationship. It's a relationship of abuse, quite clearly, quite covertly, as well as overtly. And that is something which is manifested quite directly in Look Back in Anger in terms of Jimmy's abuse of Alison, but also in the choice of metaphors in a bear-squirrel game. So I find that's a very interesting correlation. Okay, then we have Dr. Pratim Day, who is asking in the play Look Back in Anger, Jimmy's character actually symbolizes lower class masculinity. Now my question is how masculinity depends on class. Where masculinity is entirely about class, it's about caste, it's about religion, it's about class. Where masculinity is hardly a biological category. Masculinity depends on so many other signifiers, which are quite external. It's how you speak, how you dress, how you pray, what you eat. That determines your masculine embodiment, not just in terms of how you biologically carry yourself, but how that behavior is extended. And this is what I meant at the beginning of the play, that this performance is embedded as well as extended. So the class location is very, very important in Look Back in Anger, in the same way as a caste location would be if you read something like, I don't know, Mulkraj Anand's Untouchable, because even there we have this lower caste boy who's trying to be this virile boy, the sports person, trying to class up in some sense, and obviously suffering trauma, suffering systematic abuse at the hands of the society around him. And we have something similar happening in Look Back in Anger. So we have this constant tension that Jimmy Porter has to class up, to become something that is not, to attain the upper class location, and that aspiration towards upper class is manifested through so many kinds of masculine performances. The way he wears a tweed jacket in his home, the way he's smoking a pipe, the way he's constantly using literary references over and over again. And this is something which should strike all of us who in literature, when we take a look at language of any particular text. Why is Jimmy Porter's language so literary in quality? Why does he have this anxiety to show off his literary erudition? The fact that he's read Shakespeare, the fact that he's read Emily Bronte, the fact that he's read Wordsworth, even when he's abusing someone, he's using literary references over and over again, right? And obviously that's part of the anxiety package that he's trying to class up in some sense, because his location is lower class, right? And that is something which never quite comes off, right? Now, if you see the film, and I'm glad this question came up, if you see the film starring Richard Burton, there's an interesting character in the film who doesn't appear in the main text. There's an Indian merchant, an Indian shopkeeper, who comes in and opens the shop in the same place where Jimmy runs a sweet stall. And Jimmy, for some reason, becomes friends with him, the Indian shopkeeper. Now, obviously, the shopkeeper suffers abuse, racial abuse from the other white shopkeepers around him, who look at him as some kind of a threat. That is obviously the early days of racism, the early days of xenophobia in Britain, 1960s, where the Indians are just coming in after the end of imperialism. And he's seen as an outsider. And the only person who empathizes with him, in some sense, is Jimmy Porter. And at some scene, at the end of the scene, where he is just sent off from the market, he's driven out from the market, and Jimmy tries to defend him, but they cannot. Interestingly, the workers' union, which is supposed to be the very, very left-wing, very working class, they're the ones who get rid of him. So we can see how even in the left-wing, lower-class unions, you have internal politics of racism operating, where they don't accept Indian shopkeeper. There's a very moving scene at the end of it where Jimmy goes to him and says, well, why did you have to come to this bloody country? Why did you come here at all? And then the reply of the Indian person is, because in my country, I'm an untouchable. So I just came here because there's no caste. But then, lo and behold, there is class in Britain. There's racism in Britain. So you have different kinds of discrimination operative and Look Back in Anger. And most so, if you take a look at the film, I would really recommend that film, because the scene in the film also, now that I mention it, where Jimmy and Helena, they go to watch a movie. It's a movie within a movie, and they're watching a movie in a cinema hall. And the movie is about imperialism. The movie is about a British army attacking Indian peasants with guns, right? And we have some British people behind Jimmy Porter who are enjoying that scene, because Jimmy's mocking that scene. He comes as some kind of a threat to the scene. And the other British people around him, they become very, very disturbed. They ask him to leave the hall, right? Because still want to, and this is interesting, because what that particular movie within a movie does, it gives you the constant consumption of the legacy of imperialism, right? So even if imperialism has ended, we have the British coming and smoking pipes, and they want to consume that in a film. They want to consume that in cinema. And Jimmy Porter obviously doesn't want to consume it. So he becomes an outsider even there. Right? So the class, the imperialism, everything are connected categories in Look Back in Anger, especially in the ways in which the markers of masculinity manifest themselves. Okay, we have Seema Sarkar, who is asking, Jimmy has two women, Alison and Helena, Hamlet only Ophelia. Comment, well, Ophelia is not really, I'm not saying Jimmy Porter is a direct replication of Hamlet. I'm not saying it's a sequel to Hamlet, that everything should be structurally replicated. I'm looking at the gender politics in the play in terms of how women are abused. It doesn't really matter the number of characters who appear in the play. So I hope I made that point. Okay, so Sora Patro is asking, did any kind of English racial anxiety work in the minds of the 1950s England? I think I just answered the question with my reference to the film, where you have an Indian shopkeeper coming in, and obviously there's race in Look Back in Anger throughout, because when Colonel Redfern comes back from imperial India back to England, he comes back with the racism. He comes back with, and again in the film, if you take a look, when there's a scene where Alison meets the Indian shopkeeper, and Jimmy introduces the Indian shopkeeper to Alison. And Alison is someone who's grown up in India, in a very imperial colonial India. So she's not used to talking to Indians on an equal basis. And there's a very interesting reference that Jimmy makes, and he notices her unease when she's talking to the Indian shopkeeper. And he says, well, you are still the Mem Sahib, aren't you? And the reference to the Mem Sahib is very, very important, because that obviously locates up as some kind of a person who's still consuming the legacy of imperialism, right? Whereas Jimmy is obviously departing from the legacy in some sense. Okay, so okay, we have a series of questions now. Can I just okay, can I select just two more, if that's okay?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, let me take a look. Yeah, that's a really good question from Tanya Nyogi. I'm going to take that. Jimmy keeps on blowing his trumpet. Well, that's a metaphor as well. Blowing your own trumpet is like making your presence felt. So it's metaphorical. At the same time, it's quite literal, because he is actually blowing his own trumpet. And there's a reference to jazz, a constant reference to jazz. And that connects to the earlier question about race as well. Because if we take a look at jazz, the history of jazz in terms of its music, it came from black singers. Jazz is, etymologically speaking, a music of, racial protest, anti-slavery music. It's music that came from the black musicians. And look at the way it has been subsequently appropriated by white rebels like Jimmy Porter. So the appropriation of jazz, he constantly plays jazz all the time. And if you take a look at the film again, he's always playing jazz. And even when two women are talking to each other, Jimmy makes his presence felt by blowing his trumpet. We can do a Freudian study, of course, and look at the trumpet as some kind of phallic instrument that he's otherwise suffering from. So he's constantly playing with the trumpet. It's like an overcompensation for his inadequate masculinity. But I'm more interested in looking at the music politics in Look Back in Anger, in terms of how it connects to race, because jazz is quite logically, quite etymologically, historically speaking, it is a language of protest, black protest. And Jimmy Porter appropriates that as some kind of a working class protest against upper class, discrimination. So yes, Jimmy keeps on blowing his trumpet. Is it some kind of compensation? Yes, definitely, for meaningful linguistic communication that Jimmy fails to achieve with Alison and society in general? Could there be a parallel between Ophelia's mad song and Jimmy's hysterical trumpet blowing in terms of the failure of the spoken word. This is actually very, very brilliant in terms of the question. I would agree. I hadn't thought of it before, but I've learned from this question now. One can definitely make this connection between Ophelia's mad song and Jimmy's jazz trumpet, because both are departures from meaningful sentences, from meaningful words. Because at the end of the day, Jimmy is he is an important man, and I use the word important quite literally. And no matter how much he shouts, he'll never get heard. No one will listen to him. He doesn't make any difference. I mean, nothing that he says will make any difference in a British society. So the worst, the best he can do in terms of his location as a rebel is to get louder and louder with jazz, right? So that's obviously a departure in some sense from the meaning-making mechanism. With Ophelia, it's more tragic because that is not allowed to her. It's not given to her purely because of a gendered location, right? And also because of a privileged location. She's a daughter of a courtier. She's not really a royal princess directly, right? Although we see even if you're a royal princess, if you deviate from the masculine norm, we see what happens, how you're punished for that. If you read Webster's Duchess of Malfi, it's a very fun example of that. Despite being the Duchess of Malfi, you're punished for owning your sexuality, departing from the masculinist principles, right? So I think the failure of the spoken word is more tragic in Ophelia, and in terms of Jimmy, it's more pathetic, and that's a very key difference. Jimmy Porter is a pathetic figure, whereas Ophelia is a tragic figure, and there's a degree of anti-climax in Look Back in Anger. So if I'm not a big fan of looking at Look Back in Anger as some kind of a direct sequel to Hamlet. I don't do that reading, but I think it's a dwindling of human tragedy. The tragedy in Hamlet, the feminist tragedy, the tragedy of language, that actually dwindles into some kind of pathetic form in Look Back in Anger. So I find Look Back in Anger as a more pathetic play than a tragic play, because as Jimmy Porter says, there's no grand cause left. There's nothing left to be tragic for. The best you can be is to be pathetic in this post-imperial landscape, right? So I think that's a very, very key question. Okay, I'll take one last question. Okay, there's several questions which ask me which is a better play. So maybe I can pile all that up and say which of the two is a better tragedy. Okay, am I required to make a personal answer or an academic answer? Which do I enjoy reading more, Hamlet and Look Back in Anger? Well, personally, I find there are certain scenes I like in both the plays. I mean, I find the Gravedigger scene as fabulous. I mean, I find it delicious in a way how a prince is slapped so hard in terms of his language game. I mean, I'm such a big fan of that scene, the Gravedigger scene. And I read that sometimes I want to read Hamlet. I start with the scene where we have the Prince of Denmark appearing with his boy band, his fans, and he wants to tease the Gravediggers, tries to play the language game, and he's beaten black and blue left and right with language. So that scene, I think, is classic post-structuralism, and it's also so Marxist. It's telling you, well, you may have been to university, you may have known how to deconstruct language, but here we have two gravediggers who dig in the graves and beating you black and blue at your own game, right? So I find that scene fantastic. But in terms of relevance, well, political relevance, I find Look Back in Anger as a more politically relevant play in terms of how, there's this massive dissolution about political promise, the end of an era, it's the beginning of a new era, and everything is gone. There's just no brave causes left. So in that sense, Look Back in Anger is a more politically relatable play to our times. But in terms of masculinity studies, I find both plays to be very, very engaging in both forms. Now, just because I was asked about this personal predilection, personal question, I will end on a personal note as well. One genre that I'm a big fan of, and this is something which connects to Look Back in Anger, is spy fiction, spy cinema. I find that it's a very interesting genre for masculinity studies, and I'm a big fan of James Bond as a genre of literature, genre of cinema, because, and I'm trying to connect this to Look Back in Anger, because James Bond was written at a time where Ian Fleming was writing the James Bond series, pretty much contemporary with Look Back in Anger, and we have this gritty realism of emasculated England in Look Back in Anger, where England is no longer a superpower. America and Russia are the big powers. No one takes England seriously. The old bogies have come back from India. No one takes them seriously either. It's become a bankrupt country, etc., etc., etc. Now, it is in this cultural climate that James Bond gets written. And if you read James Bond, if you see the films, for example, I mean, he is this, immaculate, flawless, undying white spy who never gets caught, never runs out of cash, who is always endlessly endowed with capital, with commodities, with women who are commodities. And that I find is interesting because James Bond, I read James Bond as a post-imperial white fantasy. Right? I hope I'm making sense. It's a post-imperial white fantasy, which is very, very, nostalgic in quality. Right? So James Bond is the spy that England doesn't have anymore. Right? James Bond is a spy which is impossible to have in England anymore because England is bankrupt and no one really takes English intelligence seriously anymore. The KGB and the CIA are the big boys in the game, right? So no one really cares about the MI anymore, right? So James Bond is actually, it's like going back to the empire and digging up a white male from the empire. It's like Kipling's Kim. You dig up the spy from there and locate him in a Cold War landscape and make him immaculate and make him perfect, make him flawless, make him endlessly endowed with cash and capital and commodities, right? So I find James Bond to be a very interesting study apropos of Look Back in Anger. Now, if you want to have a more gritty take on British intelligence fiction at that point of time, I would recommend you read John le Carre's novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which is a fantastic, one of the best spy novels ever written, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John le Carre, which very clearly tells you the British spies at the time that just, they're also ran. They're like pathetic. No one takes them seriously. The KGB and the CIA are the big spies in the game. And, the spy who came in from the cold, the British spies are really someone, not glamorous at all. So it's spectacularly unglamorous. Whereas James Bond is a quite literal whitewashing. It's like a glamorization of a spy system, of a certain kind of white masculinity, which is non-existent. Because the white masculinity in post-imperial England is Jimmy Porter, right? Who was dwindled, who was pathetic, who was not even tragic in terms of how it was located, right? At least Hamlet has the luxury of tragedy because of his princely status, because of his language, because of his social location. There are people who feel for him because it's so lofty in terms of his language. Although we as students should see through that, should deconstruct that as students of literature. But, Jimmy Porter is at best pathetic. And in that sense, it's more real, I think. So I think just to end, in terms of my personal take on these two plays, I find both plays very, very interesting. I'm a big fan of the Gravedigger scene, which is why I would put Hamlet a little ahead in terms of its quality, in terms of its dramatic quality. But in terms of the political relevance, I find Jimmy Porter and Look Back in Anger as more close to my times. And I connect that to the fantasy of white masculinity, which is exhibited spectacularly in James Bond. I mean, I admit I'm a fan of the franchise, but that's because I love to deconstruct that. I see James Bond entirely as a British male fantasy of creating this perfect spy who never dies, who's timeless, ageless, perfectly dressed as a nobleman in some sort, speaks the perfect British accent, never gets caught, never runs out of capital. It's such a fantasy. And that fantasy had to be created as some kind of wish fulfillment category, collectively speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. This is really an amazing interacting session. And now I request our host, Shreyasi Roy, my colleague, of course, to carry on the session further. Shreyasi? Hello, Shreyasi.
Ask her to unmute her microphone.
Yeah. Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Chinmada. And thank you, sir. Now we are at the age of this session as well as the series. And on behalf of the Department of English, Kharagpur College and EGRA SSB College, I would like to convey my thanks to Dr. Abhishek Parui, sir, for sparing his time with us to deliver this outstanding lecture. And it is really very thought-provoking, scholastic, very illuminating and informative session. And obviously, we are looking forward to have many more interactions with you, sir. And thank you once again. Thank you very much. And I must say that this lecture is going to be very beneficial for our students and scholars as well. So thank you, sir. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the entire organizing team, Shoshi, Professor Mumu, and Shishi, who has been in touch with me. It's been a privilege to be here, and I find this idea of the webinar. I must congratulate the entire team for having such a wonderful range of topics. I have been following some of your lecture series, and I've learned a lot. And I've learned a lot from this session as well. Some of the questions were excellent. The trumpet question from Dania was brilliant, I think. I must go back and reread that. So I'm hoping you'll archive this lecture and record it in some form that we could go back and see as well. I'm not sure if you're doing it already.
Yes.
Definitely, sir. Definitely.
Yes, and if it's possible, if you could archive all the sessions and put it up in social media for me to revisit and for my scholars as well, that would be really, really good. But thank you very much again, the entire organizing team, for having me, and I look forward to visiting Kharagpur College in person in happier and healthier times. Thank you.
You are always welcome, sir. You're always welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. So now we have reached at the valedictory session of this online lecture series that definitely nourishes our mind and fills us with more knowledge.
Okay.
Yes, sir. You are audible, sir. You can. You are audible and visible too.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
sir.
you, Shreyashi. Good afternoon. I would like to convey my gratitude and thanks to Dr. Abhishek Paroi for the wonderful and engaging speech today. Today, the online lecture series last day that has been organized by both Kharagpur College and Egra SSB College English Department that has commenced from 17th June. I also convey my honor and gratitude to Dr. Vidyut Samanto, Principal, Kharagpur College, keeping in view the student interest of both the colleges. I also express my regards to all our distinguished guest speakers for gracious us for their erudite speech. I also thanks to organizing committee of both the colleges, Kharagpur College and Egra SSB College, Department of English, students, participants, dignitaries, and organizing the online series lectures of the organizers. Also for the cooperation, untiring effort for the completion of these lecture series. Today, I also hopeful the lecture series is of immense help to our students as well as other participants that has enriched all. It also has shown the function of digital platform in teaching learning process and possibility of further exploration of this future. Hope that we'll be able to organize many more such programs in near future. Before finishing my speech, I think that I should mention the names of the members of the organizing committee and all our resource persons who have made this lecture series a grand success. Members of the organizing committee, Jayanto Kundu, Jayanto Murmu, Mr. Pothik Pradhan, Mr. Chinmoy Mondol, Mr. Somobrata Sil, Dr. Aloychand Biswas, Mr. Somnath Mahato, Mr. Sehoshi Rai, Mr. Shishir Satra, Dr. Sudipta Narayan Das Mandal, Mrs. Somali Nundi, Mr. Indranil Mohapatra. The resource persons, Dr. Somitendra Banerjee, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Gaurbanga University, Dr. Joydeep Sarangi, Poet, Principal of New Alipur College, Kolkata, Professor Apurva Saha, Professor, Department of English and Coordinator Center of Endangered Language, SKB University, Purulia, Dr. Jolly Das, Associate Professor and Head of the Department, English, Vidyasagar University, Dr. Shreya Bhattacharya, Associate Professor, Department of English, Central University, Jharkhand, Professor Amrit Sen, Professor, Department of English and other modern European language, Vishwabharati, Dr. Subhadip Pal, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Bankura University. Dr. Annoy Mukhopadhyay, Assistant Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Kharagpur. Professor Joyjit Ghosh, Professor, Department of English, Vidyasagar University. Professor Indranil Acharya, Professor, Department of English, Vidyasagar University. Professor Gautam Buddha Sural, Professor, Department of English, Bankura University. Dr. Orko Chattopadhyay, Assistant Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Gandhinagar. Dr. Gautam Kormokar, Assistant Professor, Badabajar Vikram Tudu Memorial Project, Badabajar. Mr. Hemant Kumar Golapalli, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Vidyasagar University, Medinapur. Dr. Somrat Sengupta, Assistant Professor and Head of the Department, English, Sammilani Mahavidyalaya. Dr. Saurabh Kumar Nag, Assistant Professor and Head of the Department of English, Ponda Thana Mahavidyalaya. Elizabeth Merino, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Culture and Society, University of Rome, Tor Varghetta. Dr. Abhishek Paroi, PhD, Darwin, UK, Assistant Professor of English, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, and Associate Fellow, UK, Higher Education Academy. If I missed it, anyone mentioned here, I apologize for that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And now again, I want to thank I want to extend my sincere thanks to the principal of EGRA SSB College, Dr. Deepak Kumar Tamili sir, and principal of Kharagpur College, Dr. Bidyut Kumar Samanto sir, for being the backbone in our endeavor. Their support and guidance have always encouraged us to work an extra mile. I owe special gratitude to the organizers. It is their dedication, enthusiasm, determination that ensures this lecture series a resounding success. I would also like to acknowledge all our esteemed speakers who took the time out of their busy schedule and showered us with their pearls of wisdom and knowledge. Last but not the least, I thank all our students, research scholars, dignitaries, and all good hearts behind the screen for your love, support, and cooperation. They remained patient throughout and encouraged the morale of the speakers by their gusto and enthusiasm. Thank you so much for being the pillars of the support. And as you know that in this pandemic situation, when we all are confined at home, organizing webinars or online lecture series is not that easy. But if you shower your support and blessings on us, we will keep on organizing such proceedings with innovative ideas that, of course, enrich our mind. And once again, I thank you all for your attention. Stay safe, stay connected. Now, I would like to hand it down the session to Chinmay Mondal, of course, my colleague. So over to you, Chinmay.
Thank you, Sasi. And first of all, I would like to thank the two principals, that is Bidyut Samanta and Deepak Kumar Tamli sir, for their kind cooperation, and of course our students and all the participants, and of course many of the scholars I find in the screen who are always there with us within the due course of the lecture. And though it is a long and hectic session, but I must say that we got a huge response, and it is only possible because of your cooperation, and it obviously encourages us to organize more such online lecture series. So we are not sure, but we are thinking over it to organize again a lecture series from the next month, from 15th of the next month, if possible, because of the huge responses we got from this lecture series. Of course, no more today. I now I would like to request Pothik Pradhan to take over the platform. Pothik, up to you.
Thank you, Chinmoy. First of all, I would like to thank both the principals, Dr. Vidyut Kumar Samanta and Dr. Deepak Kumar Tamili, who had been there always with us, who have always encouraged us and have patronized us to organize this lecture series, and who had always, who always had been by our side while we have been undertaking this Herculean task completing the lecture series, because we all know that we have been troubled a lot for the last 2 weeks. But now, to say, after the completion of the last lecture, there is a realization that hard works actually ultimately pay at the end. And lectures from our distinguished and learned resource persons, we really have been enriched a lot. And I think that it has created a sort of interest in us, as Chinmoyda had told earlier, to wander over organizing another lecture series. We'll look what we can do about that. And of course, we all are thankful to our students, to the participants from institutes across India and even outside India, for being with us, for making the lecture series successful, and for making the interactive sessions so much engaging. Thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone is associated with this lecture series, who at some point of time have extended his or her helping hand to us. And obviously, I must thank Srikanto Bosagda, who has managed to stream it on YouTube. And last but not the least, as it's customary, I might have missed names of some people to mention during this Thanksgiving note, and therefore I beg their pardon. And now I would like to request Mr. Jayantakumar Murmu, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of English, Kharagpur College, to share his thoughts on this lecture series. Jayantada, please.
Thank you, Pratikda. I believe everything has been said in every possible way by my previous speakers. But again, I would like to thank the both principals from both the colleges, from Kharagpur College and Negra SSB College. And I certainly would like to thank my dear colleagues and Pratikda, you also, and Mr. Srikanto Bosak for helping us to stream this lecture session live on YouTube, and all the participants from our college and from other colleges also, and all the viewers on YouTube. I would like to thank them also to make this lecture series a success. Thank you all.
Now I request Somobroto Sil to speak a few words.
Thank you, Chinmoyda. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of the Departments of English, Kharagpur College and Negra SSB College, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to both the principals, Dr. Vidyut Samanta and Dr. Deepak Kumar Tamili, who had been the backbone behind this entire lecture series and who encouraged us to go forward with this endeavor. A big gratitude and thanks to all the distinguished speakers who took time out of their busy schedules to provide us with sessions that were encouraging, that were enlightening and academic, to say the least. Thank you to all our students from both the colleges who were patient, who took part who participated in all the sessions rigorously, to all the research scholars who took time out of their work and became a part of this lecture series. Deemed with the success, we hope that we will be back soon again, as my dear colleague Mr. Chinmoy Mondol said, that we will be able to back again with such a lecture series in future. in the end, once again, thank you to one and all who have been a part of this lecture series and was instrumental in making this a grand success. Thank you.
Now I request Somnath Mathur to speak a few words. Somnath, are you hearing? Are you here? Somnath, please unmute your mic.
On behalf of the college, I would like to express my sincere thanks to all and to make and due to some network problem, I am not able to reach all the sessions due to only network problem. So once again, I thank all of you, all the participants, all our colleagues. Okay.
Now I can see Pothik also. Sorry, I can see Sitir also in the screen. So I request Sitir to speak a few words. Sisir? Sisir?
I think he is disconnected.
He has left the meeting.
Disconnected. So, Shreyasi, please give the declare the session to be end of the session.
Yeah, once again, I thank you all for your attention and hope we will be back again maybe in next month. So hope for the best. Stay safe, stay connected. Thank you all.
Thank you.